Hello, I'm John Coleman from ApocatastasisInstitute, an Institute for the Humanities and Alternative College and High School here on New Milford, Connecticut, USA. The purpose of this broadcast is to get our weekly poetry under our belt. This is part of the Poetry at Apoc series. And before we get into this piece by Joel Barlow, just a note about our dear college. We have many standalone courses as well as unified curricula for those who want to replace traditional high school or college studies with something much more serious. But as regards literature, if you go to our School of Arts tab, you can see various literary courses that we have and previous poems, upcoming classes, and a whole rundown of those sciences. So for our language department, for example, we have Arabic and Latin, Spanish, introduction. And for literature, we have the likes of Dante, Say It, appropriate to this series, Say It, Poetry and Life, Literature 100, the Bedrock Foundational Texts and Concepts, and so forth. So I encourage you to check this out and to consider enrolling at Apocatastastis. We accept students of about 15 years of age on up. All right. So as of this broadcast, we are in the octave of Cristobal Colon, Christopher Columbus. In fact, I happen to be recording this on the auspicious Columbus Day itself. And in fact, as Columbus was a Latin Catholic, he would appreciate, I think, the use of the octave, the celebration of 8 days, the main holiday, and the subsequent 8 days. So here we are, whenever you're watching this, probably immediately in the 8 days following Columbus Day, the octave of our man here. So, you know, Columbus, this Italian um, adventurer, explorer, by happenstance, stumbles into the combined kingdom of Castile and Aragon at just the right time as the Muslims were being shown the door and the Jews were being shown the door. And Spain was on the march, and Spain had a great deal of momentum behind it, which would serve itself in the ways of the world very well in the coming centuries, especially with England yapping on its heels. In any case, Columbus gets the ear, especially of Queen Isabella, and is able to finance explorations across the Atlantic. There is an excellent biography put out by Washington Irving of Sleepy Hollow fame. Irving was an ambassador to Spain, I believe, during the Jefferson administration, and had access to many of the documents, the primary documents around the Columbus expeditions, of which there were many. And that biography is well worth a read and ought to be found in your local library if your library still has books. In any case, Irving was a New York writer when he wasn't over in Spain. Today's poem comes from a Connecticut author of about the same time, and that is Joel Barlow. In Reading, Connecticut, there's Joel Barlow High School. My New Milford High School chronically played them, and I seem to recall them chronically losing to Joel Barlow. Reading, Connecticut is a very interesting town, much like Ridgefield, of which it abuts. It has snagged many authors over the years and many artists, popular and otherwise, down to Mary from Peter, Paul, and Mary. In any case, Joel Barlow wrote the Columbiad, which is our poem this week. And that Iad ought to ring a bell if you're at all familiar with literature. There are a conga line of poems which end in the suffix iad. We can think of the Aeneid, the Achilliad, the Thebaid, the Henriad, the My contribution most recently is the Denaldiad. There is the Christiad. There is a humorous take on this whole approach. I'll explain what this is, and we'll get into the poem. There's the Dunciad, which is an epic poem on idiots, dunces running the world. All of this really goes back to the Iliad. Iliad is the grandfather of this whole tradition. And it is the epic tradition, the tradition often involving war, in the case of the Aeneid or the Thebaid, but sometimes much higher themes, such as the Christiad, or political themes like the Henriad or the Donaldiad, if I dare put my doggerel amongst the illustrious family of Eads. In any case, the Columbiad takes as its theme Christopher Columbus and his journey across the sea with all sorts of recourse Joel Barlow makes to mythology. Hesper is a character, the god of the West. The old name for Italy for the Greeks was Hesperia, by the way. And it's actually told from the point of view of Columbus in chains. Columbus, like many great men, had a lot of nobodies trying to tear him down. And at a certain point, those nobodies really had the ear of the queen. And Columbus was put into chains in what he considered for the remainder of his life his greatest humiliation. And in fact, when he was finally vindicated by these losers who had tried to slander him, he decided to be buried with those chains, those marks of humility and humiliation. The poem takes place as Columbus is rotting in a dungeon at his lowest point, and he's treated to visions if he perseveres, like Ulysses and Aeneas. If Columbus perseveres at this lowest ebb of his life and pushes on to the west, uh, great vistas of human energies and greatness will unroll. And of course, Joel Barlow is writing in the early period of the American Republic. So he gives Columbus this vision of all of subsequent Western Hemisphere history, which will only happen if Columbus goes through with it, if he soldiers through his dark night of the soul. There's much, much to say. Let's just enjoy these opening points. You will recognize from Milton the argument, which is a summary before each section. Barlow says, the subject of the poem, an invocation to freedom, condition of Columbus in a Spanish prison, his monologue on the great actions of his life and the manner in which they had been rewarded. Appearance and speech of Hesper, the guardian genius of the Western continent. They quit the dungeon and ascend the Mount of Vision, which rises over the western coast of Spain. Europe settling from their sight, and the Atlantic Ocean spreading far beneath their feet. Continent of America draws into view and is described by its mountains, rivers, lakes, soil, and some of her natural productions. Very familiar to anyone who's read the Odyssey, the Aeneid, the Thebaid, the Henriad. I sing, the mariner who first unfurled an eastern banner over the western world, and taught mankind where future empires lay in these fair confines of descending day, who swayed a moment with vicarious power Iberia's scepter on the new-found shore, then saw the paths his virtuous steps had trod, pursued by avarice and defiled with blood. The tribes he fostered with paternal toil, snatched from his hand and slaughtered for their spoil. Slaves, kings, adventurers, envious of his name, enjoyed his labors and purloined his fame, and gave the viceroy from his high seat hurled, chains for a crown, a prison for a world. Long overwhelmed in woes and sickening there, he met the slow, still march of black despair, sought the last refuge from his hopeless doom, and wished from thankless men a peaceful tomb, till visioned ages opening out his eyes, cheered his sad soul and bade new nations rise. He saw the Atlantical heaven with light o'ercast, and freedom crown his glorious work at last. Almighty freedom, give my venture a song, the force, the charm that to thy voice belong. 'Tis thine to shape my course, to light my way, to nerve my country with the patriot lay, to teach all men where all their interests lie, how rulers may be just and nations wise. Strong in thy strength, I bend no suppliant knee, invoke no miracle, no muse, but thee. Night held on old Castile her silent reign, her half-orbed moon declining to the main. O'er valley lowlids, regal turrets hazed, the drizzly fogs from dull Pisuergia raised, whose hovering sheets along the welkin driven thinned the pale stars and shut the eyes from heaven. Cold-hearted Ferdinand his pillow pressed, nor dreamed of those his mandates robbed of rest. Of him who gemmed his crown, who stretched his reign to realms that weighed the tenfold poise of Spain, who now beneath his tower in dungeon lie, sweats the chill sod and breathes inclement skies. His feverish pulse, slow laboring through his frame, feeds with scant force its fast expiring flame. A far dim watch lamp's thrice reflected beam throws through his grates a misencumbered gleam, paints the dun vapors that the cell invade, and fills with sceptred forms the midnight shade. When from a visionary short repose, that nursed new cares and tempered keener woes, Columbus woke, and to the walls addressed the deep felt sorrow bursting from his breast. Here lies the purchase, here the wretched spoil, of painful years and persevering toil. For these damp caves, this hideous haunt of pain, I trace new regions o'er the chartless main, tamed all the dangers of untraversed waves, hung o'er their clefts and top their surging graves. Saw traitorous seas o'er coral mountains sweep, red thunderous rocks the pole and scorch the deep. Death rear his front in every varying form, gape from the shoals and ride the roaring storm. My struggling bark her seamy planks disjoin, rake the rude rock and drink the copious brine, till the tired elements are lulled at last, and milder suns allay the billowing blast. Lead on the trade winds with unvarying force, and long and landless curve our constant course. Tu autem Domine miserere nobis Deo gratias. Thus are the opening stanzas of the Columbiad by Joel Barlow. Of course, the poem is much, much longer. It's equal, if not longer, in size as the Odyssey or the Aeneid. I should also mention, as it strikes me, that the Divine Comedy of Dante is very much in this tradition as well, though it does not end in Iliad. I will link below in the description the full poem on this project Gutenberg site, which we benefited from. And as I say, you ought to be able to get a copy of this poem, if you're in New England especially, at your local library. So with that, on this illustrious octave of this illustrious man, Christopher Columbus, a great man, a man like many great men, who has had to, for 500 years, deal with nobodies trying to tarnish his name. And, well, you can't keep a good man down. We'll leave it there. All right. Thanks for hanging out here. And do consider enrolling at Apocatastasis. You can check out all of our literature classes if you go to our School of Arts tab. Thank you so much.